airplane mode. So.
I'll bet most of you didn't realize that this room also doubles as a sauna. Welcome to the Poetry Room, everyone. And I'm Peter Maravellis, your host. And tonight we're delighted, once again, we've been doing more and more of these with our friends over at the Center for the Art of Translation. And we got them in the room tonight. Always a pleasure. They're our neighbors now, so it's just a thrill to have them in here. And, you know, yes, we're known as being the home of the Beat Generation, but, you know, translation was such a huge part of the project from the very beginning. And Ferlinghetti put such a premium on. And in fact, one of the very first books that he published was translations of Jacques Prévert. So this goes back many, many, many years and is very meaningful to us. So, and especially celebrating a New Directions book, because we also have a very strong connection to them on many levels. So Katrina Dodson is going to be in conversation with our dear friend Rita Bullwinkel. And the book is called Covert Joy, Selected Stories. And this is not the first time Katrina has actually translated the works of Clarice Lispector. There's also another wonderful collection, which we have here, which I encourage all of you, if you're not familiar with her work, please check it out. And that is also published by the wonderful New Directions. So, of course, Clarice Lispector is one of Brazil's greatest modern writers. And Katrina's done an amazing job. I mean, just so thoughtful and painstaking in the way that she translates. And so this is, I think, not only going to introduce the work to, you know, kind of a younger generation, but I think for those of us that, you know, have already been fans of the work, that this, you know, kind of gets us deeper down the rabbit hole. So Katrina Dodson is the translator of The Complete Stories by Clarice Lispector, as I mentioned, which is the winner of the Penn Translation Prize, as well as other awards. She's also done a translation of Mario de Andrade's Brazilian modernist classic, Macunaíma? Macunaíma. Yeah. The Hero with No Character, which is published also by New Directions in 2023. Her writing has appeared in The Believer, McSweeney's, The Paris Review, and elsewhere. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California and is an affiliate scholar of the Brazil Lab at Princeton University. She's, of course, a San Francisco native, yes, but lives in Brooklyn and teaches translation at Columbia University, but it's great to have her back. And, of course, our dearly beloved Rita Bullwinkel is the author of Headshot. If you have not checked it out, we have that up here. It's now in paperback and a bestseller here at City Lights. And also the book Belly Up, which is the winner of the Believer Book Award. She's a 2022 recipient of the Whiting Award and editor of McSweeney's Quarterly. She teaches courses in creative writing, zines, and the uses of invented and foreign languages as tools for word building. It's such a delight to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Let's
do it.
Okay. Did you want to read it here? Okay, good.
Esta história chama-se A Quinta História.
The fifth story. This
Esta
story
história
could be
poderia
called
chamar-se
The
As
Statues.
Outro
Another
nome
possible
possível
name
é O
is
Assassinato.
the murder, and also
Também
how
como
to kill
matar
cockroaches.
baratas.
So
Farei então
I will
pelo
tell
menos
at least
13
three
histórias
stories, all true
verdadeiras,
because
porque
they don't
nenhuma delas
contradict
mente a
each
outra.
other. Though
Embora
a
uma
single
única,
story, they would
seriam
be
1001.
1,001, were I
Se mil e
given
uma noites
1,001
dessem.
nights. The first, how to kill cockroaches, begins like this. I was complaining about cockroaches. A lady overheard me. She gave me this recipe for killing them. I was to mix equal parts sugar, flour, and plaster. The flour and sugar would attract them. The plaster would dry up their insides. That's what I did. They died.
The other story is actually the first one and is called The Murder. It begins like this. I was complaining about cockroaches. A lady overheard me. The recipe follows. And then comes the murder. The truth is that I was only complaining about cockroaches in the abstract, since they weren't even mine. They belonged to the ground floor and would crawl up the building's pipes to our home. Only once I prepared the mixture did they become mine too. In our name, then, I began to measure and weigh the ingredients with a slightly more intense concentration. A vague resentment had overtaken me, a sense of outrage. By day, the cockroaches were invisible, and no one would believe in the secret curse that gnawed at such a peaceful home. But if they, like secret curses, slept during the day, there I was preparing their evening poison. Meticulous, ardent, I concocted the elixir for drawn-out death. An excited fear and my own secret curse guided me. Now I icily wanted just one thing, to kill every cockroach in existence. Cockroaches crawl up the pipes while we, worn out, dream. And now the recipe was ready, so white. As if for cockroaches as clever as I was, I expertly spread the powder until it looked more like something from nature. From my bed, in the silence of the apartment, I imagined them crawling one by one up to the laundry room where the darkness was sleeping, just one towel alert on the clothesline. I awoke hours later with a start when I realized how late it was. It was already dawn. I crossed the kitchen. There they were on the laundry room floor, hard, huge. During the night, I had killed. In our name, day was breaking. Up in the favela, a rooster crowed.
The third story that now begins is the one about the statues. It begins by saying that I had been complaining about cockroaches. Then comes the same lady. It keeps going up to the point where, near dawn, I awake and still sleepy cross the kitchen. Even sleepier than I is the room from the perspective of its tile floor, and in the darkness of dawn, a purplish glow that distances everything. I discern at my feet shadows and white forms, dozens of statues scattered rigid. The cockroaches that have hardened from the inside out, some belly up, others in the middle of a gesture never to be completed. In the mouths of some, a bit of the white food. I am the first witness of daybreak in Pompeii. I know how this last night went. I know of the orgy in the dark. Inside some of them, the plaster will have hardened as slowly as during some vital process, and they, with increasingly arduous movements, will have greedily intensified the night's joys, trying to escape their own insides, until they return to stone, in innocent shock, and with such a look of wounded reproach. Others, suddenly assaulted by their own core, without even the slightest inkling that some internal mold was being petrified. These suddenly crystallize the way a word is cut off in the mouth. It's you, I, they who, taking the name of love in vain, kept singing through the summer night, whereas that one there, the one whose brown antenna is smeared with white, must have figured out too late that it had been mummified precisely for not having known how to make use of things with the gratuitous charm of being in vain. Because I looked too deeply inside myself, because I looked too deeply inside. From my cold human height, I look at the destruction of a world. Day breaks. The occasional antenna of a dead cockroach quivers dryly in the breeze. From the previous story, the rooster crows.
The fourth narrative inaugurates a new era at home. It begins, as we know, I was complaining about cockroaches. It goes up to the moment I see the plaster monuments. Dead, yes. But I look toward the pipes from where this very night a slow and living population will renew itself in single file. So would I renew the lethal sugar every night, like someone who can no longer sleep without the eagerness of a rite? And every dawn lead myself to the pavilion with the compulsion of greeting the statues that my sweaty night has been erecting. I trembled with wicked pleasure at the vision of that double life of a sorceress. And I also trembled at the sign of plaster drying, the compulsion to live that would burst my internal mold, a harsh instant of choosing between two paths that, I thought, are bidding each other farewell, and sure that either choice would be a sacrifice, me or my soul. I chose, and today I secretly boast in my heart a plaque of virtue. This house has been disinfested.
The fifth story is called Leibniz and the Transcendence of Love in Polynesia. It begins like this. I was complaining about cockroaches. That was quite fun. Katrina, that was such a brilliant idea to read this totally iconic story this way. We were talking earlier about how maybe this story lends itself to multiple narrators better than most. What was your process like for translating this story specifically?
I don't remember this story specifically. The one that I spent the most drafts of is the one that opens this collection, which is called Love, Amour, it takes place in the botanical garden in Rio, and it has these really kind of lush moments of murder in the garden. There's a lot of murder in nature. But this one was actually very straightforward. I think, there's something kind of like a fugue form. There's something very symmetrical about it and matter of fact. And so it goes like the cockroaches in single file, like one word after another. So it actually wasn't so challenging. It wasn't as challenging to translate as something like Love or her kind of philosophical, one of the most like kind of head-spinning stories, Uovo e a galinha, the egg and the chicken. But the reason I wanted to read this one is that I think it just captures so much that is Clarician. It's really darkly funny. It's sinister, but there's like this kind of mystery about it, and there's this like a kind of sensuality but underlying violence to it. So you're laughing, but then you're also disturbed, and we talked a little bit. I mean, you had said, you were really interested in all of the endings to her stories, and they end so abruptly. And this one just kind of, it's like the fifth story is, the story of the Leibniz and Love in Polynesia.
Yeah,
it's a joke, but it could open onto another, universe of meaning. So
yeah, I absolutely adore her stories and am delighted to share that I fell in love with the work of Clarice Lispector through your translations of her collected stories years before I ever met you, which is quite romantic. The collected stories translated by Katrina was gifted to me by a dear friend and former roommate, Meg Weeks, who is a Brazilian scholar and Portuguese and Spanish translator. But one of the things I really love about these stories, specifically the ones that you've translated, is that they all seem to really highlight one of the things about Clarice, if I may. Clarice's work that is so masterful was her total understanding of the real importance of beginnings and endings and the relationship between one another. This story specifically, I adore this ending. It has this elliptical energy. It begins like this. I was complaining about cockroaches. It's like the end eats back on the beginning in a way that feels so satisfying in the way that really, really amazing endings do, where you feel like something's ending, but then also something's continuing or like reflecting a shadow back on what you've just read. Her endings also have this really often this intense sense of departure, both sometimes in time and place. We've talked a little bit about this before joining the party with you all. This ending is one of my favorites of hers. The ending in A Chicken destroys me. I also really like the ending of The Smallest Woman in the World. I think those two are maybe my favorite. Do you have favorite endings of her stories?
I mean, I don't know if I have a favorite, but they are, yeah, I mean, it's so hard to end, this kind of, whether it's a short story or a novel, this emotional journey, it's hard to end it in quite the right way. You don't want it to sound too pat or too just, and I think her endings they're all really amazing sentences. And they do so much, but they seem kind of effortless. I mean, we can read. I mean, a chicken, uma galinha, is about this. Says she was a Sunday chicken, still alive because it wasn't yet 9 a.m. So she was the chicken that the family's going to eat for their Sunday lunch or dinner. And then she escapes. She has this kind of heroic escape, and then becomes, kind of like chicken woman, and the family. And she lays an egg. So she's this awkward squawking chicken, and then she performs a miracle of laying this perfect egg. Eggs and chickens are this whole, the theme in Clarice, and so the family suddenly just, pauses in this mad dash to capture lunch, and they see that she's a miracle and she's performed a miracle. And so they decided to adopt her and keep her in the family. I hope it's not a spoiler to just
No, I think we should spoil it.
Happens.
I think we should spoil it.
So then, she's part of the family, and she's just,
There's
everyone's...
also so much amazing, I feel like, gender dynamics in the story.
Yes.
Like the dad
chicken,
is like
chicken
really
are
excited
women.
about having to go and catch something. He's like, that's right, I'm the dad. I'm like the man. I can catch this chicken and feed my family. Kind of like in this idea that's like, I feel like almost this mocking tone of the breadwinner.
And these are written in the 60s. So this story, most of the stories in this collection are from her kind of golden period of being like incredibly popular. And these stories are, big bestsellers. So 1960 and 1964 were the two collections that these come from. Yeah.
And so the chicken is like anthropomorphized. I mean, in terms of like, it's a beloved pet.
Yeah, she's a little woman. She's part of the family. And then
you
suddenly...
love her. So by the end of the story, you love her. And then the final sentence is...
Yeah. Or like leading up to the, so though even then, let's see, she's sitting here, the expression would change on her, though not even then. So she's completely transformed in the eyes of the family, and yet she's still somehow fated to be the same chicken that has existed since the dawn of time, centuries. So though not even then would the expression change on her empty head, while fleeing, resting, giving birth, or pecking corn, it was a chicken's head, the same one drawn at the start of the centuries. In the last sentence, until one day they killed her, ate her, and years went by. So on one hand, it's like, burr, 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 burr.
I feel like
also horrible.
Oh my gosh, I think that is... You know what's amazing about that ending is that the whole story you are developing, you're both like, let's, why use the second person? The truth is I am identified with the chicken. I'm like, I am the chicken. Also, I love the chicken. And then that it ends in this, like, all of this chase and everything for the chicken eventually to be reminded that they are food. And then I love that last clause, and years went by. Like the family continued this incredible leap forward in time after this long story. Oh, I just love it. I fear it's such a potent story. You have to buy the book and read it to experience this jump forward in time.
And then one translation note on the story is that it's called uma galinha, a chicken, and previous translations had titled it The Chicken. But I think it's very significant that she's just another chicken. It's a chicken who becomes the chicken and then goes back to being just the same chicken drawn at the start of centuries who's fated to just be killed and eaten.
Yeah. Oh, I love that it subverts, it has some fable energy to it, but it subverts classical fable structure, I think. Devastating, good ending. I mean, the ending of The Smallest Woman in the World.
I think it has more psychology in it.
Right.
A myth or fable structure is all, kind of like action and very simple. And this gets really into, she feels like a personified chicken.
Yeah, I definitely.
Not just stay on the chicken for so long, but it is it's an important theme.
One thing I'm so interested too. I mean, just another ending that really sticks with me is the ending of The Smallest Woman in the World. which is perhaps maybe for me the most surreal and absurdist story in the collection, in this book, and you're learning about this. There's been discovered like the world's smallest woman who is 18 inches high.
Yeah, some 17 and 3/4, and
Yes.
I forget centimeters.
And
You know,
you meet
I
you
translated
meet all
it
of these,
into
like,
inches.
You meet
18 inches.
You
yeah,
meet all of these
18
like
inches.
scientists who are studying her, and then at the end of the story, there's this incredible switch where you just meet this, after this long story, this totally new character, this kind of like banal, judgy, Bible-thumping housewife who the last sentence is something along the lines of like, you never know what God has an impulse to make.
It's an old woman. Yeah, I mean, this story is, I think it's one of the most unsettling.
It's very
and,
unsettling.
It's like, it has, just very strong colonial
Deeply.
overtones, imperial. So, I mean, basically, it's an African pygmy woman who's discovered, quote unquote, by a French anthropologist, ethnographer, who's kind of like the heroic anthropologist, Marcel Prêtre, and he decides to name her Little Flower, Pequena Flor. And so then part of the story takes place, in the scene where he meets her and he's measuring her and he's studying her, and she's naked, she's pregnant, and she starts laughing this laughter that's very disturbing to him. I mean, I think it's a story I can never make up. Like many of her stories, I can never make up my mind about it, about what's going on. But the story then shifts to what I imagine to be living rooms in Rio de Janeiro. It's somewhere in the West. She comes out. Her picture is printed life size in the Sunday supplement, and then you see all of these people in their bourgeois living rooms kind of exclaiming like, "Oh, this poor woman! She could be our little doll. She'd be in our family." So it just portrays these people responding to this picture in the paper of this woman and the idea of this woman, and then we cut to this old woman because look, suddenly declared an old woman, shutting the newspaper decisively because look, all I'll say is this: God knows what He's doing. And it just kind of
which to me, I mean,
yeah, but this is where I just wanted to say, because this is what happens right before you're back on the scene with Little Flower, Pequena Flor, and Marcel Prêtre, and she kind of turns the tables on him, not even meaning to, but he's asking her all these questions, and Little Flower answered yes, that it was very good to have a tree to live in, her very own. For, and this she didn't say, but her eyes went so dark that they said it, for it is good to possess, good to possess, good to possess. Et bon possuire. The explorer blinked several times. Marcel Prêtre had several difficult moments with himself, but at least he kept busy by taking lots of notes. Those who didn't take notes had to deal with themselves as best they could. So, this man who's kind of, deciding that he's going to tell the story of who this little woman is, and then, it's a story about possession, about, owning or eating the other, possessing the other, whether it's through scientific knowledge or just her wanting to possess his little ring, his hat, him, and he's very unsettled by it, that she suddenly is acting like a person when she should be his scientific object. And then you have this old woman just kind of like shutting the paper on it and saying, well, God knows what He's doing. It's like so much in 3 paragraphs.
Yeah, which to me feels very, it's like she narratively takes us in a circle, like around character, or in a character that somehow I always feel both identified with and also empathetic for. There's like this really intense circling energy. Something with that story and the other stories we've talked about in all of her stories is they do spark in me more than anything questions, which is something that really potent fiction always does. But I when I finish reading one of her stories, I'm always like, what question is she asking? What question is she circling? Because she has such a circling energy with her prose. And you have spent so much time with her work. I wonder, in this selection of her stories, what questions do you think she's most closely asking?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing I thought of when you're saying that is the last story that they decided to put to close the the selection with, it was the publisher, it was a mix, the publisher Barbara Epler made the final decision on what 20 stories would be in here, but I gave input, other people gave input. They were but so the last story is That's Where I'm Going, which I think is the closest thing she ever wrote to a prose poem, and it ends toward the end. She says, "What am I saying?" And I think that is, so many of her, so many of her stories just they pose a question. I think, it's hard to formulate. I mean, there's so many questions in these stories. I think. I'm not sure if I can formulate what I think her main questions were, but I think they have to do with the mix of tenderness and violence in the human spirit. And there's a lot of tension between, so-called civilization, or the ways that we present ourselves in public, and the way we present ourselves with our friends, with our families. One of the most famous story collections is called Family Ties. And it's a lot of many of the stories from that collection, which was like her blockbuster collection, are in this selection. And there's so many stories over and over again about a mother in relation to her husband and to her children, or, a daughter and her mother. And there is always this tension between wanting to be good and wanting to be, protecting and nourishing your family and loving your family, but then also these violent impulses to want to be alone and to want to commune with something beyond the human. So I think there were a lot of questions about the relationship between the human and the non-human. There's so many animals in her stories.
Absolutely.
And even, in the scene in Love where it's, the outlines are a story of this bourgeois housewife in Rio de Janeiro who starts off the story being, very proud of the seeds she's planted, and her children are growing up so nice and her life is so beautiful. And she's coming home on the tram with her groceries, and suddenly a blind man chewing gum upends everything. He can't see her. He's chewing gum. The tram has stopped, and somehow he's just like a slap in the face, insulted her, and she drops her groceries, and the eggs break, eggs again, and she dashes off of the tram and runs into the botanical garden and thinks she's safe. And suddenly there's just murder all around. She sees like what look like blood stains. They're just like purple fruit stains on the bench, and there's like a hairy tarantula and rotting things. And so, but instead of she's horrified, but she's also intoxicated. So there's a lot of this, I think these questions about human nature and what being around other non-human natures brings out in us that's elemental.
I think it is Joy Williams who says the reason why writing about animals is interesting is because having an animal in the story immediately begs the question of what is the difference and what is the fictional border between the human and the animal, and where does humanity, I'm sure I'm giving a terrible paraphrase of this elegant Joy Williams quote of like, where does humanity begin and end? And even with the story that we read collectively, with the cockroach story, they're totally anthropomorphized. They are like the cockroaches become the victims of Pompeii. You identify
and they're her enemy, but her companions also,
deeply,
her nightly companions.
Yeah. Okay, this incredible, beautiful new publication has an absolutely heart-stopping, beautiful afterword written by you, as well as a foreword by Rachel Kushner. And I because I had read your collected translation, we were earlier, it's hard to believe, 10 years ago, that book came out, and crazy that it's been 10 years, it's been a decade. But so I had read those stories cover to cover a decade ago. And so I had read everything in this, because this is a selection. I had read these stories before, but it was a long time ago. And so I read your afterword first, and something that you reflect on in your afterword is that one of the biggest things that's happened for you personally in the 10 years since the collected stories came out is that you've become a mother. I have also become a mother, and how you feel like that has changed your reading of these stories. And it was so interesting to me reading your afterword and then reading these stories. And I really had this feeling that was like, this is asking so many questions about motherhood. How did I miss that? How did I miss that? That this is about so many of the things she's circling is about art for me are about in the selection, how is it possible to what is the relationship between mothering and the individual, and they're also a lot more gendered than I remembered for whatever reason. I wondered if you would talk a little bit about your writing of the afterword, and I mean that the collected stories have been out 10 years, how when you went back and reread the selection to write the afterword, how that breath of time struck you.
Yeah, I was a little bit afraid to go back into these stories. I think that both because the process of translating the complete stories was so intense. It was for 2 years, from 2013 to 2015. And in a lot of ways, it was a really dark period in my life. And I think I really gave myself entirely to this work. And it was very demanding. And the stories, each story over and over again is many, a lot of them what I call women on the verge, women on the verge of having some kind of like spiritual crisis over and over and over again, 86 times. And so I was afraid to just go back into that headspace that I'd left so far behind. And then I was afraid as a translator to kind of revisit choices that I'd already made. And I didn't know where I was going to want to fiddle versus leave alone. And I mostly left it alone. There were a couple things that I fixed. Not that many. But, the one big one that I knew was wrong as soon as it came out was in the egg and the chicken. She says, understanding is the proof of error. I think it's entender é prova de errar. So it's the proof of, and it's a infinitive. So I had it in the first version of making an error because I was trying to make it match that somewhere else. But I realized with the rhythm, understanding is the proof of error. It sounds so much better. So just little things like that changed. But it was a really intense experience to go back and just reread these 20 stories all together. But it was also very pleasurable. I think it just, you enter the space of her world. And I think I did spend so much time with the stories that I mostly didn't want to change things, and I just kind of fell back into the pleasure of them. And one thing I noted was that even though I wasn't in the initial heat of translating them, I still felt, what I call like wave after wave of volatile energy crash out. There's so much energy that's really just powerful and exciting in all of her stories, her language. That's another one of her questions that she was always asking was, what lives beyond language and how can we get there through language? And I think that's why she experimented so much with her Portuguese of kind of deforming it here and there so you don't have just the ready-made sentences, the expected syntax. And I think, Rachel Kushner also, I think, felt that energy in her introduction. She names it a gram of radium, which comes from one of the stories, Mineirinho, but she talks about this kind of like dangerous gram of radium that's in the stories. And so, like you said, I realized that I was very attuned to how many of the protagonists in her stories are women, and many of them are mothers. But I think this time around, I felt it on a kind of more visceral level. It's like, oh, her mothers are all so tired all the time. And I think when you know that intellectually, it's one thing. And I thought about my own mother, but now when I'm experiencing it, and the tug of war between, I'm out here with my daughter who's 1.5, and Yeah, you're always like, I'm so tired, but wait, I want to do this. I have to go do my thing, my events, but then who's putting the baby to bed? It's in the stories so much.
One other thing
Yeah.
that Rachel Kushner claims in the introduction, which, but I'm open to a literary scholar correcting Rachel Kushner and I on this, but she makes a case for Elena Ferrante being heavily influenced by Clarice Lispector. And timeline-wise, it is possible, and I feel totally convinced. I was just like, oh yeah, that's definitely what happened.
She compares a character in the Foreign Legion, Ophelia, who's this kind of precocious little girl, to
Yeah.
Leela, the bad one in
I see it completely.
in My Brilliant Friend.
But maybe
I have my
subconsciously.
theory. Yeah.
I'm fully ascribed to this theory.
I think she is a reader of Clarice Lispector. I think she's written about her. I can't remember now, but I will say that I was definitely reading Anne Goldstein's translations of all of Ferrante that I could read while I was translating the Lispector. So
The resonances in the work
Yeah,
are
I
very
think-
loud. It's
I think Ferrante's less experimental with
Deeply.
language
Yes,
from
yes.
how I get it in the English, but I've
Deep-
heard
yes.
that the English is a little bit smoother than the Italian. But I think that there's this volatile energy lurking under the surface, especially
Yes.
between the female characters.
violence off screen.
Yes, but like they're ready to boil over at any moment.
And sometimes
Yes.
it does, like, the
Yeah.
people are murdered. Like, sometimes
Yeah.
it is on screen, but there is, like, loud.
And they both have a
Loud
way of
violence off
drawing you
screen, yeah.
into this kind of delirium of someone's internal mood. And
Yeah, where you're like, don't do it. Don't. No. But then the
like there's a
energy just
scene in
keeps-
Days of Abandonment where she's inside by herself and she can't get the lock open, or there's something about this
I
kid, like,
mean-
she's like panicking and she's just alone. And there's a lot of these similar scenes.
I mean, when she's
in
in the
Lispector,
botanical
yeah.
garden and she begins to
Yeah.
see murder everywhere.
This is in love, yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I was kind of like,
Yeah.
get back on the train. Like you can do it. But
Yeah.
But no, she's like in that internal space that we've probably all been in of collapse. She's inside the moment. So she can't, that's the space that she needs to be in. Okay,
Yeah.
something else about this prose, Katrina, it's just absolute magic to me about this is that, the prose of this translation of this work that you have made is so lush. It's so poetic. Your ear is so immaculate. And I have no faculty in Portuguese, but I can only imagine how difficult it was to translate something that you have rendered it in English with such an incredible rhythmic ear. What is the process of translating something that pays that close attention to sound and rhythm?
I mean, I think it comes from the original language, which is such a pleasure to read. Her Portuguese is so gorgeous. And I think as disorienting as it can be, it pulls you, it really propels you along with this rhythmic force, even if the words don't hang together quite right. They're not, like I said, she bends language, but she doesn't quite break it. Like grammar. And so I tried to match a lot of the rhythms that I was feeling in the sentences. And I think some sentences are very banal, they're very regular, but I think you can feel as a translator and as a reader too, you can feel just where there's a crescendo and suddenly one sentence or phrase holds a lot more weight than others. And I think as a translator, you try to match that and try to be attuned to the sentences and language that carry a lot of weight. And that's where you might spend a lot more time on that one single sentence. Or I think with hers, a lot of times the order of events in a sentence is very important. So I might do something that's not as natural in English, but there's a kind of suspense of the sentence where something, it's like there's a scene in Love where it's something that's like down the avenue came, and you don't know, it's like, a cat but you're not sure what's going to happen. And so things like that, or, at the end of a line in a line of poetry, that word at the end of the line holds more weight. So I think sometimes that it works a similar way, where the last line of a sentence, how she lands the sentence, is very important. So sometimes I would pay attention to that.
I have just one more question for you, and then maybe if the audience would like to ask questions, we would be delighted to bring you in. Katrina, you are certainly a translator who I know, because I love reading your prose so much, that you have such incredible taste in what you choose to translate, and anything that you translate I would just immediately buy and devour. And there are a few translators like this. I know you know this, right? Where you're like, oh no, there's this new, Portuguese language author that I've never heard of before, but Katrina's translating them. It's gonna be so great. So what other translation projects are you working on? Have you worked on in the last 10 years since the collected stories came out?
I'm kind of laughing because it's the complete stories, and then Makunaima, which is a notoriously impossible to translate modernist classic from 1928 that took me 6 years.
Wow, I can't wait.
I mean, it's not really, it's, I've been teaching this whole time, and I don't think I'm a traditional translator in that way. A lot of my colleagues who are full-time translators, they're translating 3 or 4 books a year. Whoa. And it's hard work, but I think, the Lispector is maybe 6 books in one. Makunaima, I call it 2 books in one, because it's he wrote it in 6 days. It's very famous, but then he spent another year and a half putting in all this research, and there's a lot of Brazilian folklore and all these references. And, I come from a scholarly background, so my edition's kind of the secret critical edition, but for popular readers. So there are a lot of notes in it. I'm teaching a class, that's why I'm here. I'm teaching a class at Berkeley, a graduate course on this book. So, so I think these 2 really just exhausting and exhaustive projects, I think, and then having a baby kind of made me take a pause. So there are a couple of projects that I want to translate, but I'm actually turning toward a writing project that is triangulating translation, Brazil, and Vietnam in my life. So my background, I actually have no Brazilian background by blood, even though I speak Portuguese fluently, and I know so much about Brazil, much more about Brazil than I do about Vietnam. But my mother was born in Vietnam, and I also speak Vietnamese, not so well, but I studied it, in college and studied abroad there. So I'm working on a project, a nonfiction kind of book-length essay called Saudades for Vietnam, that's thinking about the kind of famously untranslatable word saudades, which can mean, it's a form of nostalgia, but also just missing somebody. Saudades, and or just it's been described as absent love. So I'm thinking about some unexpected connections between Brazil and Vietnam, but also, some of these kind of strange detours that life can take. One thing I was talking about at dinner, so my current obsession, I guess, as a translator too, and just as kind of a personal obsession, is I've been spending this time with the 1651 Jesuit dictionary. It's at the New York Public Library. It's online too, but I love to just go to archives in person. But it's in Vietnamese, Portuguese, and Latin, and it's the book that is the source of how Vietnamese went from being written in Chinese script to Romanized into Western script, to Roman script. And so you always learn that it was the French who did it, but it turns out it was the Portuguese. So it's this weird, it's almost like imposing this external logic to something I've always thought was so random, that I'm Vietnamese, mixed-race Vietnamese American, translating Brazilian and being kind of a fake Brazilian, and how does that work? And why are there things when I was thinking, I was in Brazil and learning Portuguese, I'm like, there's so many resonances, it feels like I already recognize this. Am I just putting 2 coastal tropical countries together? But it comes back to the Jesuits, I guess. It's my view on that, but I think it's, we come to this point where in your life where you want to unravel some strange just strange mysteries, personal and historical. So I'm in that moment. But I will be translating. I mean, this is also a weird kind of translation-ish project, I suppose. So, yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. Oh my gosh, such a joy to hear about. Questions for Katrina?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
It's the long cable. Or you can loop, if you can loop it around, it'll give it more slack.
Yeah.
Any takers? Ah, good.
Sorry, I've been since the first time I read Amor. Actually, I've been wondering who was she influenced. So I was really shocked by what she was writing in the '60s, and I'm wondering who was she ever influenced by someone, or that was just someone really insightful who was just beyond her time?
I think toward, after she became more famous, the more famous that Clarice Lispector became, the more mysterious she would be in her answers to questions. She just kind of got sick of it. So she has her last television, her first and last, her only television interview where the interviewer is kind of peppering her with questions, and then at a certain point she just goes, "É segredo," it's a secret, which is a really good tactic if you don't want to answer a question that you're just like, "É segredo." But so I think it's this mix of like this self-created mythology, but also what people imposed on her, because it sounds like it, she sounds like nobody else almost. But so I think there's this kind of one urge to say that she just kind of dropped out of nowhere. She just like hatched from her own egg. And it was just this, amazing writer. But the truth is that everybody comes from somewhere. And so she was, as a young person, she read Steppenwolf. She was really, really in love with Catherine Mansfield. And I think a lot of her work, like Near to the Wild Heart, her work in the 40s, evokes Catherine Mansfield, and I think to the extent that Catherine Mansfield and Virginia Woolf are have a kinship, it also evokes Virginia Woolf. But she was, she actually wrote a fan letter to Mario Giandraggi, who's the other author, the modernist author, asking him, well, I sent you my first book, have you read it yet? And he died very shortly after, and so he never responded. But I was shocked to see that. So she was influenced by Spinoza. So I think she was very interested in philosophy, but she read, Brazilian authors, and she translated from English and French. She translated Jules Verne, and who did she translate from English? She translated other. It's a kind of a mixed bag. It's funny. Wow. I don't know if those were the influences, but I think she was definitely influenced by a mix of authors, and was very much an intellectual. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Possibly, I don't know, but possibly, yeah. And she was Ukrainian, yeah. So I think there's a kind of, the kind of like Slavic sensibility definitely in there, yeah.
Is that it? Are you sure? Anyone online? Let me take a look.
We have one more.
Good.
You and the Bjork T-shirt.
You mentioned that Brenda. Okay. Hello. You mentioned that somebody else made the final call on which stories would be included, and there's so many in the complete stories. Is there one you want to draw our attention to that didn't make it into Covert Joy that you felt strongly about and didn't get
Oh
there?
my gosh. I mean, I'm glad I didn't. I'm relieved I did not have to make this choice. And I think when I read these stories, each one conjures these other stories that are in the complete story. So it feels like it's phantom limb. Like I'm reading this and I'm like, but where's the other one? And where's this? One that I really loved that didn't make it in was Daydream and Drunkenness of a Young Woman. This woman's kind of like getting too drunk and she's hallucinating and kind of like behaving. She's this like proper bourgeois woman, and then suddenly kind of just like loses it at some business dinner with her husband and like some some I can't remember who it is, but it's a really fantastic story. There's so many, but the one that made it in that I had to make a case for was the fifth story, the one that we read. That it was supposed to be 19 stories. And then I said, well, I mean, the fifth story, it's a really important story. It's one of her most famous, and it was one of the earliest to get anthologized into English. And it's so great. I just think it captures so much of what these stories do so well, and it's so short and does so much in a short amount of time or space. And so, the book got a little bit delayed, and then Barbara Epler, the publisher, kind of sidled up to me at this event in New York and said, well, you'll be happy to know we were able to include the fifth story. And like the burst of joy that I felt, it was like very disproportionate, but I'm very happy that it made it in. I would have felt very sad. Yeah.
I was wondering about the period in which many of our stories were written, which was a very difficult period, like in Brazil. The movie I'm Still Here just came out. And I was wondering if there is any relation to some of her mystery and some of her reticence in relation to, the general intellectual, like censorship that was going on. And also, my other question is, how does it relate to other trends that were happening in Latin American short story writing? I'm thinking of Cortázar, and others, and I was wondering if you could put that in context for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's considered like a late tail end modernist in terms of her experimentation with language. And she is of a generation, I think some of her, they were a little bit younger, but it's like Caio Fernando Abreu, a short story writer. He is somebody who was very influenced by her. And I think, she wrote, so the dictatorship began, and it lasted for 20 years, so it began in 1964 and then ended 1984. So, these stories were, most of the stories that came out in 1960, 1964 were written between the 50s, but also early 60s, and a lot of them came out in a magazine. The later ones from the Foreign Legion came out in a magazine called Senor. That was kind of like the kind of cool literary magazine at the time, and that's where Caetano Veloso first read her work. And I think she marched against the dictatorship and censorship. She wasn't, she wasn't an activist. I think, although I think she always had a political sensibility to the extent that she had a very strong sense of ethics and justice, and she was one of the first women to graduate in law from her university in Rio. And I think one of the stories in this collection that shows her at a more openly critical political sensibility is Mineirinho. And so that came out, looking up the date, there was a police shooting in 1962 of an escaped convict in Rio, whose nickname was Mineirinho, and he was very popular in the favela that he was from, kind of supporting the community. But so he escaped from prison, and then he was shot, 13 times. And so this is one of the, it's a really cry of revolt, this story, or this chronica, you'd call it, so kind of like literary column. And so I think that is one of the stories that I would point to, or one of the pieces where she is voicing this cry of revolt against state violence. And I think that it's the military, it's against the military police, but it's also I think it does resonate with the greater conditions of oppression in Brazil under the dictatorship at that time. And that beautiful movie, I'm Still Here, I Know Still Cute, and resonating with people being disappeared in this country now,
Coming to the top of the hour, last call. Rita, any parting thoughts?
I guess I have, well, I mean, you can ask what, but my question for you as a reader was, you know, I have met very few people who've read all 600 plus pages of the complete stories cover to cover, and you are one of them. And I was wondering, you know, you read it in 2015, this 10 years ago, coming out, so, I mean, what was it like for you to revisit the stories so much later?
It was wild. I'm trying to think of a way to describe it. It had like an olfactory element to it, where you know that feeling when you smell something and it like ignites it. It was like I was like, you know, I think it's because your stories are so lush as you have rendered them. So you're in the prose and everything immediately feels familiar because I'm back in your sentences. And then in certain elements, like there was like immediate, I was like, oh, I know how the story will turn. But then others like had faded from my memory, so they were much more fresh. It was so interesting to return to them. You know, we talked about how with my reading of these, you know, I saw so much more motherhood than I remembered. It's interesting, this question about the political context, which I know I know broad strokes outlines Brazilian political history, like in the vaguest abstract sense, but I did read it as very political. And of course I'm reading it, you know, I reread this in the last week. So I was like, oh yeah, this is like a deeply, I had that thought on my own. I think the stories are extremely interested in the political context in which they were written, or just general archetypal political forces of power, or they were for me as a reader. Katrina, such a joy and privilege to be with you here to celebrate this incredible publication. Thank you all so much for coming out.
Well, you know, that would be something like, I can take that. I can take this.